It's election season in Canada, and the Conservative government, led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper, is fighting for a third term in office. Amidst the political media blitz, there has been a longer-running, carefully strategized media push from one of Canada's biggest, most important industries, oil and gas. The tar sands, or oil sands as the industry calls them, in the western province of Alberta are the third largest proven reserves of oil in the world. Since their potential was first explored 50 years ago, there have been many stories in the Canadian media highlighting the tar sands' environmental impact, greenhouse gas emissions, and safety concerns. But in the last decade or so, oil companies have attempted to counter the negative PR, pouring money into media outlets through advertising and sponsored content. And they've been supported in their media campaign by the Harper government that has pursued a pro-oil agenda. So for every oil story that makes the headlines, many go untold. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now from Alberta on the Canadian oil industry's impact on the country's media.
The energy that keeps us moving.
When the energy you invest in life meets the energy we fuel it.
The energy that brings us together.
We're fortunate to have energy.
The energy that drives our economy.
Canada's energy sector, its oil companies, have bought up a lot of airtime. Their message is clear.
Life takes energy.
It's an ad for the oil companies saying that we are stewards of the land. We promise to look after everything.
We will never stop working to protect our environment, our people, and our communities.
If you look at ads for Greenpeace, you'll see the most grotesque spewing of toxins coming from these refinery plants.
Expanding tar sands production will deepen the climate crisis.
So there's a real dissonance between how the oil companies see themselves and how the opponents of the oil and gas industry want to convey this.
Up until the beginning of this current federal election campaign, I mean, you couldn't pass a bus stop or a subway shelter. You couldn't turn on the TV. You couldn't turn on the radio. You couldn't go to major Canadian online news sites without seeing huge, glitzy, overwhelming oil sands industry propaganda.
Fort McMurray, the heart of Canada's oil industry. As gallons of oil are pumped from the ground, millions of dollars flow into pro-industry messaging across the country. The Harper government's Natural Resources Department spent $40 million on advertising in 2013 and 14. $16.5 million of that was aimed specifically at the domestic market. We spoke to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or CAP, who represent more than 200 oil companies. CAP say they've already spent $2 million on ads this year, and that's in addition to the many media campaigns run by their members.
Over the last 5 years, our industry has gone from not advertising or not really communicating at all to being very active in the public sphere. There's been a lot of public dialogue around the oil and gas industry.
There's a growing concern over a toxic spill.
And it's been important for us to get our message out.
There was a time when the Canadian media were able to resist the influence of big oil money and still do their journalism. Today, with many media organisations in serious financial trouble, they've become dependent, some might say addicted, to the revenue from the petroleum industry, which leaves Canadians wondering just how much of the real story gets reported and what doesn't. Fueling the media scepticism are a few conflict of interest cases.
And there is a propaganda war circling the oil sands.
In 2014, it was revealed that Rex Murphy, a high-profile commentator for Canada's public broadcaster CBC, was being paid by the oil industry for speeches at their corporate events.
The people who criticize you, why are you listening to them?
The CBC defended Murphy, saying, quote, "The most important thing to understand is that Rex is not a regular reporter." But that's not true of Peter Mansbridge, the host of CBC's flagship news show.
He spoke to the oil and gas industry and did not say, "You guys are great, you know, keep digging for oil." He talked a lot about the value of public broadcasting and the role of the CBC in the national psyche. He said all the right things. The problem was he took a speaker's fee of $28,000, which leaves the impression that he's the best journalist money can buy.
When you have such an important economic center, the media is going to be influenced by that. There's so much advertising dollars coming from the oil industry into the media, so naturally, they don't want to piss off that sector.
It's going ahead with a massive project, and what an undertaking it is.
I think it's safe to say that if you look at most of the reporting, that it's not critical in any great degree of the oil industry in this country.
This presentation was delivered to CAP in 2013. It outlined a strategy for collaboration between CAP and Postmedia, a conglomerate that owns 45 of Canada's daily newspapers. According to Douglas Kelly, the Postmedia representative, we will work with CAP to amplify our energy mandate. The National Post newspaper will undertake to leverage all means editorially, technically, and creatively to further this critical conversation. We asked Postmedia to explain the thinking behind their collaboration with CAP. They sent a brief statement. We are proud to have CAP as an advertiser. Theirs has been an innovative marketing program across our brands and platforms, which adheres to clear labelling guidelines. There are editorial outliers. Mike D'Souza covered the environment beat for Postmedia for 8 years.
If you look at the work I did when I was at Postmedia, they gave me an enormous amount of freedom to pursue a lot of stories. I don't think anyone would say it represents the interests of industry. If there is a problem in the Canadian media in general, that's, I guess, a problem that has to do with the size of newsrooms and budget cuts. But I was, for the most part, self-assigning, and I could do a lot of interesting stories.
Bruce Livesey has a different story to tell. He put together a documentary for Canada's second biggest private broadcaster, Global TV. The film was on Charles and David Koch, billionaire brothers prominent in US politics, big in the energy industry, and key players in the debate over the controversial Keystone Pipeline running from Canada to the United States. The documentary was pulled just days before transmission.
They made the claim that this story was unbalanced, yet never explained what the other side was or how it was unbalanced. The story had been vetted by a very cautious lawyer, their lawyer. It had been vetted by my boss, who was also worried about it. So the only explanation is that the subject, that it was critical of the oil sands, it was critical of the oil industry, and it was critical of these very, very powerful people. Someone possibly thought this is going to offend advertisers in that rather vital sector, and we can't afford it.
The media in Canada, like so many other places, are in a funding crisis. News outlets, both public and private, have faced budget cuts and layoffs. So the petrodollars that are buying up airtime and print space are plugging a gaping hole.
These guys really did sit down and whiteboard out a strategy, shutting down their critics and just steamrolling Canadians through a massive advertising campaign.
Think oil and natural gas developed the Canadian way is good for Canada?
We spend a lot investing in media relations. We spend a lot in community relations. We spend a lot in research.
And it hasn't worked. Not one new pipeline approved. Massive protests. And I think a real credit to Canadians that they didn't fall for this nonsense over the last few years.
Critical reporting on the energy sector is persistent, despite the PR push to counter it. But for some Canadian media outlets, as long as money continues to come from the oil industry, there is always the chance the message could be polluted.
If you want to understand Canada's massive oil and gas industry better, there are a couple of alternative news outlets that our contributors recommended. The National Observer is an online outlet that focuses on energy, politics, and the environment. The site was set up by journalist Linda Solomon Wood to provide a counter to the mainstream discourse on oil and the environment. It has an entire section dedicated to reporting on the tar sands. Next is CanadaLandShow.com. It's a crowd-funded podcast and website that has run a number of stories exposing the relationship between the oil industry and the media, as well as many other investigative pieces. Canada Land broke the story of Global TV's decision to drop Bruce Livesey's documentary on the Koch brothers.